Justice Samuel Alito tried to embarrass Jasmine Crockett in front of the nation, but instead he became the one who couldn't handle the truth and left the hearing without saying another word. The hallway outside room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was unusually quiet that morning. You could sense the weight in the air, not because of what was on the docket, but who was. Justice Samuel Alito had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to appear before the Oversight Committee. That alone had drawn every camera, reporter, and law clerk in Washington to the edge of their seats. Inside, the long mahogany desk stretched across the front of the chamber. Congressional members filtered in, taking their places. Some looked excited, others grim. Alito sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression fixed somewhere between boredom and irritation. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. Not in public, not by elected officials, and especially not by someone like Jasmine Crockett. Crockett hadn't said a word yet. She sat 3 chairs down, flipping slowly through a leather-bound notebook, pausing occasionally to underline something with her pen. She wasn't nervous. She never was. Born in Tyler, Texas, raised by school teachers, she carried herself like someone who'd spent her entire life outthinking people who didn't expect her to. Her stare was direct, steady. She didn't blink much, and when she did, it meant she'd already figured out her next 3 moves. Across the room, aides whispered to each other and passed notes. The chairman called the session to order. Cameras clicked into place. Alito gave the bare minimum of a nod. "We're here today," the chairman began, "to address growing concerns about judicial ethics and transparency. Justice Alito has agreed to take questions from members of this committee in the spirit of cooperation and constitutional responsibility." Alito raised an eyebrow. His version of cooperation had limits, and everybody knew it. The early questions were polite. Too polite. Representatives asked about court procedure, financial disclosures, and speaking engagements. Alito responded with short answers, dry legalese, and the occasional smirk. It was all going smoothly until Jasmine's name was called. She adjusted her mic, straightened her papers, and spoke in a measured tone. "Justice Alito," she began, "you've spoken often about judicial restraint and neutrality. Yet in recent years, your decisions and your public comments have raised eyebrows among legal scholars and the American people alike. I'd like to walk through a few examples." Alito leaned back slightly, arms crossed. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "If this is going to be a lecture, I hope it's at least an original one." A few staffers chuckled nervously. Crockett didn't even look up. She kept her eyes on her papers. "Don't worry, Justice," she said flatly. "You haven't heard this before." The tone shifted. One of Alito's aides stiffened. Someone from the press pool typed faster. She continued calmly. "Let's begin with the July ruling on campaign financing. In that case, your opinion relied heavily on precedent from Buckley versus Vallejo, yet you made no mention of its relevance in prior decisions on similar matters. Could you explain that inconsistency for the record?" Alito blinked. "I don't recall the specifics of your reference, but I assure you," she interrupted. "Page 17, line 4. You cited Buckley as controlling precedent when it served your majority opinion, but in the prior session, during Hancock versus Rhodes, you argued the same precedent had no bearing. Did your interpretation change in 6 months?" Alito opened his mouth, but the chairman tapped his gavel lightly. "Let's allow the witness to answer." Alito adjusted his glasses. "Judicial decisions are nuanced. You, of all people, should understand that nuance." There it was, the tone. Dismissive, almost mocking. The kind of remark that lands just soft enough to be passed off as professional, but hard enough to be intentional. You could feel the shift in the room, but Crockett didn't flinch. She just looked up slowly, then closed her notebook. Her next move was coming, and it wasn't what he expected. For a full 2 seconds, nobody said anything. Crockett stared at Alito, eyes narrowed just enough to let you know she'd heard him clearly, but not enough to let him know how much it landed. The panel was silent. Reporters paused their typing. Even the rustling of papers stopped. Alito leaned forward almost casually and said, "You may want to stick to asking questions you actually understand, Congresswoman. This isn't a city council meeting in East Texas." That did it. A quiet, stifled "wow" came from someone seated near the back. One or two aides glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh or just stay still. The chair looked up from his notes, but Crockett didn't react. No change in tone, no raised voice. Just that same calm rhythm she always had when someone assumed she was smaller than she was. She uncapped her pen, clicked it once, then said, "Justice Alito, I'm going to give you a chance to walk that back, because I'd like to spend the next 7 minutes focused on the law. But if you want to talk about credentials and tone, we can make time." Alito scoffed. "You asked me here to speak about legal precedent, not to spar over tone. If you'd like a seminar on judicial behavior, I'd suggest you start with the Constitution, not cable news." Crockett let out the faintest breath, not a sigh, just a pause. She reached into a file folder and pulled out a transcript. "June 8th, 2022, she began. "You were a keynote speaker at the Antonin Scalia Freedom Dinner. In your speech you said, and, I quote, 'This country is in trouble because elected officials don't understand the role of courts.' Were you referring to members of this committee?" Alito shifted. That quote was taken out of context. She raised a finger. "I have the full recording. You were asked by the moderator, and I quote, 'What do you think about the current Congress?' You replied, 'They don't understand restraint. They don't respect separation of powers, and they've never read Federalist 78. That's a direct quote. Silence. "So I'll ask again," she continued. "Was that statement directed at this body?" Alito cleared his throat. "I was speaking generally." Crockett nodded. "Generally, right. So that wouldn't include your appearance at the Heritage Foundation last year, where you stated that certain judges have no choice but to save the nation from legislative recklessness." Alito looked toward his aide again. She saw it. "Let me ask you something, Justice," Crockett said. "Have you ever filed a disclosure about the dinner sponsors for those events? Because in your 2021 and 2022 reports, neither one shows up." Alito replied, slower this time. "Those events were deemed personal engagements, not covered by formal disclosure requirements. But they were attended by donors actively involved in amicus briefs on cases you ruled on." "Yes, I have no control over who attends public events." Crockett tilted her head. "You accepted a ride on a private jet paid for by a donor whose organization submitted an amicus brief on Chambers versus Turner less than 6 months after that flight. You didn't recuse yourself. Why not?" The chairman leaned, and slightly watching now with genuine interest. Alito's voice was colder now because there was no legal obligation to do so. "But there was an ethical one," Crockett shot back. That line landed harder than anything else that morning. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy. No one knew whether to breathe or blink, the kind of silence that doesn't need volume to feel loud. Crockett continued without missing a beat. "You're a Supreme Court justice, sir. Your job isn't just to interpret the law, it's to model respect for it. If people see that you take liberties with your own conduct, why should they believe you won't do the same with theirs?" Alito didn't answer. He didn't have to. It was clear he'd underestimated her, and now he realized, too late, that this wasn't going to be the quiet, easy hearing he thought it was. But Crockett wasn't finished, because what she had next was even more personal, and it would be impossible for him to brush off. Crockett turned the page in her folder and glanced up, this time making direct eye contact with Alito. Her voice stayed, calm, not a hint of emotion in it. No anger, no sarcasm, just precision. "I'd like to shift briefly," she said, "to Hastings versus Roe. That case involved a challenge to voting restrictions passed in Mississippi. You wrote the majority opinion. In it, you stated that the changes in voting policy had no measurable impact on voter access. Alito nodded slowly. That's correct. Crockett leaned forward. Were you aware that your opinion contradicted two lower court rulings and directly dismissed evidence presented by the Brennan Center showing a 14% decrease in early voting access among black voters in that district? Alito opened his mouth, but she kept going. Because here's the issue, Justice. When you say there's no measurable impact, but experts are giving you measurable numbers, it makes people wonder, are you ignoring the evidence or just the people it affects? Alito shifted again. His silence spoke louder than any denial. And it's not just that case, Crockett said. It's a pattern. Bennett vs. Texas, Klein vs. Dobbs, Reed vs. Jones. In each one, your opinion either minimized the role of race or omitted it entirely, despite the plaintiffs raising it directly. The air felt still. The committee members leaned in, pens down, eyes on her. You see, Justice Alito, she continued, I've read your writing, I've read your dissents, your speeches, even your footnotes, and there's a thread that runs through them. You don't just interpret the law, you steer it, subtly but consistently, away from accountability. Alito responded finally, his voice steady but defensive. Congresswoman, the Constitution requires impartiality, not political pandering. Crockett didn't blink. And yet you've accepted gifts, travel, and speaking invitations from groups that fund political campaigns, groups that conveniently show up in courtrooms as amici in cases you rule on. She paused. You say you're impartial, but your rulings suggest otherwise. And more importantly, your behavior off the bench puts your impartiality into question. She pulled out a thick envelope and slid it forward on the desk. This is a summary of your travel records, compiled from publicly available flight logs and matched with campaign finance disclosures. Dozens of connections, none of them reported, not once. Alito's jaw tightened. Those allegations have been raised before, and they have no bearing on the legal questions before the court. Crockett shook her head. See, that's where you and I differ. Because to most Americans, a justice taking a private jet to a fishing trip hosted by a billionaire with cases pending before the court, that does matter. It might not be to you, but it does to them. She turned, speaking now more to the room than to him. To every person who's waited months for a hearing, to every kid whose future depends on a ruling, to every single citizen who can't afford a lawyer, let alone a lobbyist, this matters. Because if the highest court in the land isn't accountable, then the law becomes a weapon for the few, not a shield for the many. That line was different. No one made a sound, not Alito, not the press, not even the member seated on his side of the aisle. Alito finally said, Congresswoman Crockett, I'm here as a courtesy, but I won't stand for political grandstanding masquerading as legal critique. Her response was quiet. You're not standing, Justice. You're sitting. And right now, you're sitting in front of a country that's watching how you respond to simple, reasonable questions about fairness. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. But the next document in her folder wasn't public, and what it revealed would put Alito in a position he couldn't dodge. Not this time. Crockett gently opened a blue folder marked confidential, redacted for committee use. Her tone never changed. I have in my hand, she said, a memo submitted by your office to the Judicial Conference in 2021. This wasn't public. It wasn't part of the standard docket, but it was reviewed quietly after a staff member flagged inconsistencies in your case notes. For Klein vs. Dobbs. Alito's eyes flicked toward his aide again, just for a second. In this memo, she continued, there's a highlighted passage where you, under your own initials, suggested that the coercion was politically motivated and likely exaggerated. You wrote that before the case was ever heard. Alito raised his hand slightly, cutting her off. That document was never finalized, but it was circulated, Crockett replied, and it shows prejudice. That's a violation of Canon 3 of the Judicial Code of Conduct, which I remind you requires impartiality, not just in practice, but in appearance. Alito's voice rose for the first time. This is a political ambush. Crockett stayed seated, calm as ever. No, sir. This is accountability. She held up a printed email. And here's an internal message from your former clerk, confirming the memo was reviewed by at least 3 other chambers before oral arguments began. The room shifted. Even committee members who had stayed neutral now leaned forward, visibly uncomfortable. Alito's face reddened slightly. Clerks discuss theories all the time. That doesn't equate to bias. Crockett's voice dropped slightly. It does when the memo includes language about the political affiliations of plaintiffs. It does when your private notes label one of the attorneys as a well-known activist masquerading as counsel. Gasps. This time, real ones. A camera shutter clicked twice. Alito opened his mouth but stopped. Then almost defiantly he said, "You've clearly done your homework, but I'm not obligated to respond to cherry-picked phrases from internal deliberations." She tilted her head. "So you don't deny writing it?" He didn't answer. Crockett leaned back, folded her arms, and looked around the room. "I want this entered into the record," she said to the chair. "The memo, the email chain, the timeline of your public statements in relation to private events, because this is no longer just about opinions. This is about conduct." The chair nodded, slowly. "So ordered." Crockett turned back to Alito. "Let me ask you something, Justice. Do you believe that trust in the Supreme Court is stronger today than it was 5 years ago?" Alito hesitated. "That's not for me to decide, but you contribute to it," she said. "Every action, every decision, every donor-funded dinner, every silent refusal to recuse, every comment that implies some Americans matter more than others." She leaned forward, her tone sharp now. "Do you really believe you've upheld the standard that the robe demands?" He didn't answer, not directly. Instead, he shifted in his seat and reached for a glass of water. His hands weren't quite steady. "I'm not going to sit here," he said quietly, "and be accused of corruption." "No one said corruption," Crockett replied. "But if you're hearing it anyway, maybe ask yourself why." That line landed like a brick. The silence this time was more than just shock. It was a realization. Alito had no more room to maneuver, and everyone watching knew it. But Crockett wasn't after the headlines. Her next move was something personal, something that would leave even her toughest critics nodding in respect. Crockett let the silence linger just long enough. Then slowly, she opened the last section of her binder. There were no footnotes, no legal citations, no charts or timelines. Just a single photo, laminated and clipped to a sheet of paper. "This," she said, holding it up, "is my father. His name was Bernard Crockett. He served as a district judge in Smith County for almost 20 years. She didn't wait for a response. Her voice was steady, but something had shifted. Not rehearsed, not scripted, just honest. He worked 5 days a week and every other Saturday. He wore the same suit until the seams gave out. You know what he used to say to me before every school exam?" She looked directly at Alito. "You don't have to be louder. You just have to be ready." Alito blinked slowly. He didn't speak. "My father spent his entire life believing in this system," she said. "He believed it could protect the vulnerable and punish the reckless. But toward the end of his career, he admitted something to me. He said, 'It's not the law that's broken, Jazz. It's the people trusted to keep it honest.'" Her hand was still in the photo. "That was the day I decided to run." You could hear a cough in the distance. A pen dropped. No one picked it up. "You sit on the highest court in this country," Crockett said, "and yet you act like answering to the people is beneath you. Like ethics are optional. Like your legacy is something owed, not earned." Alito's mouth opened slightly. But this time, there was no rebuttal. Just a faint, shaky inhale. She pulled another document from her folder. This is a copy of your June 2023 itinerary. It shows you attended a private dinner hosted by donors from the American Freedom Coalition the night before the court announced its decision on Bennett versus Texas, a case those same donors had invested in through amicus briefs. Alito turned to his aide again, but she didn't meet his eyes. You wrote the majority opinion the very next morning, Crockett continued. No disclosure, no recusal, just business as usual. Alito exhaled through his nose, but his expression gave it away. He looked tired, not angry, not insulted, just worn. I'd like to remind you, Crockett added, that public trust in the Supreme Court is currently at its lowest level since Gallup began polling, and every unanswered question chips away at what's left. Alito reached for his microphone, but then he stopped. His hand hovered there for a beat, too, and then he let it fall. I'm going to request a brief recess, he said quietly. The chair raised an eyebrow. Justice Alito, you still have time remaining for responses. I understand, Alito said, but I won't continue under these conditions. He stood up slowly. His papers remained untouched. He didn't look at Crockett as he walked past. He didn't say another word. He left the chamber the way a man does when he's not running, but no longer standing tall. The door shut behind him with a dull click. No one moved. Then the chair leaned into his mic. We'll take a 10-minute recess. Crockett sat back, closed her folder and didn't smile, not even a flicker. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't humiliated him, she didn't need to. She came with facts, with questions, with proof, and she asked them the way justice should be asked, calmly, directly, and without apology. But the world outside that room was already buzzing, and the fallout had only just begun. The hallway outside. The chamber was a wall of microphones. Reporters jostled for position, trying to get a clear shot of the door where Justice Alito had exited just minutes earlier. But he didn't return. Not after 10 minutes, not after 20. Inside the room, the committee members were still seated, some exchanging hushed words, others just staring at their notes like they were seeing them for the first time. No one expected it to go like that. Not even Crockett. She sat quietly, flipping back through her binder as if the whole thing hadn't just happened. Representative Mark Ellison, seated 2 chairs to her left, leaned in and whispered, "He's not coming back." Crockett didn't look up, didn't think he would. Outside, news anchors were already live-streaming reactions. Justice Samuel Alito abruptly left today's oversight hearing after a tense exchange with Representative Jasmine Crockett. The Texas Congresswoman pressed him on financial disclosures and judicial ethics, referencing unreleased memos and travel records. Alito's silence spoke volumes. Within the hour, the story was trending on every major platform. Some were calling it a takedown, others a masterclass in restraint. But the truth was simpler. People had just watched something they weren't used to. A powerful man being asked real questions by someone he underestimated. A clip circulated within minutes. Crockett's line, "You're not standing justice, you're sitting." It was being replayed across television panels and phone screens, dissected like it was the closing argument of a national trial. Back in the room, the chairman reconvened the hearing. Without Alito. "We'll proceed with the remaining agenda," he said, glancing toward Crockett. "Congresswoman, thank you for your preparation." She nodded once, closed her binder, and finally allowed herself a small breath. Later that evening, outside the Capitol, a small group of reporters caught her on her way to the car. "Congresswoman Crockett, did you expect him to leave?" She paused, standing still in front of the flashing lights and hurried voices. "I expected him to answer," she said. "Do you think he'll face consequences?" "That's not up to me," she replied. "But the American people are watching, and sometimes that's enough to start change." Back in her office, the emails poured in, hundreds by the hour, some angry, some grateful, but most of them surprised. Not by what she said, but by how she said it. No shouting, no insults, just facts. A law professor from Rutgers wrote, "You've restored my faith in public hearings." A public defender in Arkansas, my teenage daughter watched the whole thing. She said she wants to study law now. Even some of her colleagues, those who doubted her, when she first arrived in Congress, stopped by quietly saying things like, "That was something," or "He didn't see it coming, did he?" But she didn't get swept up in it. She just kept working. Because for Crockett, this wasn't about going viral or getting a headline. It was about asking the kinds of questions regular people ask when they feel like no one's listening. Questions about fairness, about trust, about whether the rules apply to everyone or just the rest of us. Justice Alito didn't return to the hearing that day, and in the weeks that followed, he released a short statement through a spokesperson about respecting the process and maintaining focus on judicial responsibilities. But no apology came. No acknowledgement, just silence. That, in itself, spoke louder than anything he might have said. But Crockett wasn't finished yet, because in the days that followed she had one more thing to say, and it wasn't for the committee, it was for the people watching at home. 2 days after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett sat in front of a plain backdrop in her district office in Dallas. No fancy stage, no podium, just a single camera, a staffer behind it, and the hum of passing cars outside the window. She took a breath and looked straight into the lens. "Let's talk," she began. Not as a congresswoman, just as someone who grew up hearing that the law was the one thing that was supposed to treat us all the same. She didn't read from notes. She didn't wear the usual pin on her blazer. This wasn't about policy. It was about people. Maybe you watched that hearing. Maybe you only saw the clips. Maybe you didn't watch it all. But what happened that day wasn't about scoring points. It wasn't about getting someone. It was about asking questions, real ones, the kind every American deserves to ask when they see something that doesn't sit right. She paused, letting the words breathe. "You know, my first job out of law school wasn't glamorous. I defended people who couldn't afford an attorney, people who were treated like they didn't matter, and I learned quickly that justice isn't blind. It just turns its head when it's uncomfortable." She leaned forward a little, eyes sharp. "If you're watching this and you think, well, that's just how power works, I want to remind you that power isn't permanent. But the truth, that sticks around, long after the cameras turn off." She held up a small card. "This is my father's bench card. He kept it in his pocket every day he was in court. It says, 'Dignity costs nothing, but once lost, it can bankrupt a man.'" Her voice softened. "He believed in quiet strength, in being prepared, in making your words count. That's what I try to do, and I'll keep doing it, whether anyone walks out or not." She stood up, not to end the recording, but to send a message to anyone watching, young or old, who's ever been told to quiet down, to wait their turn, to stay in their lane. Don't. She picked up the binder from the hearing. Learn your facts, ask your questions, hold people accountable, and do it without shouting. Because the loudest room isn't always the one with the most power, it's the one with the most truth. She gave the camera one last look. If that hearing made you feel something, anger, pride, frustration, whatever it was, don't let it fade. Channel it, read more, ask better questions, vote with your eyes open. A brief smile crossed her face. And subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories that don't just make noise, they make change. The screen faded to black, because in the end, it wasn't about Jasmine Crockett versus Samuel Alito. It was about something much bigger. The idea that truth, spoken clearly and without apology, still matters, even in the highest rooms of power.